Hey, how's it going, everyone? In today's video, I want to talk about a topic that I struggle with a lot, and that is trying new things on complicated models, especially factions that you've never painted before. You could almost kind of call this a little bit of painter's block as well. You get to like a certain point in the paint job where it's kind of the ugly phase. You maybe tried some new techniques and maybe aren't too happy with how they turned out, and you're kind of struggling with how to move forward on the paint job. So right now I'm painting some Adepta Sororitas models, and they're very intricate, they're very complicated models. I try to do something a little bit different. This is actually for a commission, so I was talking with the customer about some ideas for the model. We decided to try an idea that I thought was actually pretty cool, and maybe didn't execute it all that great. All right, so this is how far we've gotten with the models. It's a decent way through. So the main thing I was struggling with was this bird. It's more of a statue, so I think that's what's kind of throwing it off a little bit. But I tried to do like a phoenix effect on it. So I started off with yellow and then went dry brushed orange, dry brushed into reds, and then like a little bit of a darker red. But I felt like I went way too heavy with the orange and the lighter reds and kind of just washed out the yellow. I did go back in and kind of add in some yellow. It's a little stark, but it still sells the effect, I guess. And basically I had some ideas of how I would go back and maybe touch some things up, but there's a certain point when you're doing commission work like this that I've already put a lot of time into it, so I kind of have to draw that line of how much I'm really willing to do for how much I'm getting paid. So I'm just gonna continue on with it. I think it looks decent enough, and we'll see how it turns out. So just off the bat, I know I gotta start picking out these with some white and start adding some washes onto the banners, and then start working on metallics. Model that stands inside of it, like controls it or whatever. I struggle a lot with eyes still, so you can tell they're pretty Google-eyed right now. I don't know how well you can see, but there's a few things that I can do to try and touch them up, make them look a little bit better. So I'll do my best to get that on camera and finish up all the metallics and the flames on her jetpack. I've basically taken a break for a couple days and thought about the way I'm gonna go about continuing on the model. I think that's sometimes one of the best things to do, is just take a step back, collect your thoughts, brainstorm, think about it for a day or so, and get back to it. And then just some more examples of getting frustrated with complicated models. I'm also working on this tank right now, and as you can tell, this thing is super intricate, but I can't let that get to me too much. I just gotta kind of work through it and pick out little by little, step by step. The main thing I was kind of struggling with, I started to pick out all these candles and everything and getting the wood panels painted in there. But overall, like, I think I'm really happy with how this base color turned out. Tried some new things. I haven't really painted too many tanks. Lots of little filigree and stuff to pick out, and so it's gonna take some time, but like I said, just step by step, and we'll get there, and it'll look really good when it's all done. Another part of that model that is super complicated that I've been working on is this stained glass, which actually wasn't too bad. I actually applied it from the backside. I put some satin varnish on it with an airbrush, and then started adding in with contrast paints. And then when you turn it around, it actually looks really good, I think. Still picking out all the little intricate veins of metal through the stained glass. Gotta add some metallic onto that, but it's looking good. Just take your time and little by little. In this video, I'm gonna finish the model. It's not really a complete start to finish painting video or tutorial or anything like that, but it's just more or less explaining that sometimes you have complicated models and you try new techniques to try and broaden your horizon, and sometimes they don't always work out, but you can't let that hold you back, and you just got to keep pushing forward. So let's get to it. Okay, so I sped up this footage a little bit, like 1.5 times, just so that the video wasn't too ridiculously long. But like I was saying before, with these models, you just got to take it little bit by bit. Okay, so now that we've touched up a bit of the white parts, I'm gonna go ahead and hit it with a satin varnish because I've used a lot of inks on this. I like using white ink because it's already pretty thin and it lays down pretty smooth. You do have to do a couple coats to get like full opacity, but I really like using that. I don't want any of this ink to reactivate on me when I'm starting to apply any washes or other colors on the purity seals. Alright, so I'm picking out the purity seals with some Blood Angels Red. I think that's a really good color for this. Alright, so now we're going to start applying some Seraphim Sepia to the banners. One thing I've noticed when painting models is you get to this certain stage, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, but you get to the ugly stage, and the model can really start to get daunting at that point because you start to feel like, oh man, did I really mess this model up? It's not looking good. But sometimes it really just helps to get all the parts of the model with color on it, and it really starts to come together and everything starts to accent each other. Certain things that you maybe thought were too bright or too dark will start to neutralize out a little bit. So that's another part of this whole struggle with getting frustrated with complicated models. And so just keep in mind that you might just be at that stage where it's the ugly phase and you just need to keep pushing past that, and the model will start to come together. You just got to trust the process. And at the very end, if you really feel like you need to go back and adjust something or brighten something up, make something darker, you can always go back and do that. So here I start to pick out the flames on the jetpack of the model that sits inside that other model. Sometimes it's nice to have something else that you can put down the model that you're working on and then pick up something else and start working on something else, just to keep that momentum going. Even if it's just a separate piece of the model, you can always go back and forth in between painting those models, and it helps keep the momentum going. I've actually really been enjoying painting some of these flames. I've gotten a pretty decent little workflow worked out. I start by putting some white onto the base of the flames. In this case, the tips were already red, so I kind of just left them that red because I'm going to be working my way back down to that color anyways. But after I put some white at the base, I'll add some yellow contrast paint, and then I'll work my way up with different contrast paints. Here I'm doing orange. You'll see a couple different stages. I'm going darker and darker and darker towards the tips, and I'm also just trying to feather out the contrast paint. I'm not really like doing a wet blending or anything. It's more of just apply some paint, clean off the brush, and then feather it out into the other color, and it creates a semi-decent transition. Especially on these small flames, you really don't notice the transition too much. So you just gotta play around with it a little bit, keep on going back and forth to your colors. I think I add a wash in here at one point for like the brighter yellows, just to kind of darken some of the recesses. I tend to find that when you're painting flames, you want the deeper recesses to be darker, and then the edges of the flames you want to progress to a lighter yellow, but you're starting from a bright yellow at the bottom, working your way to a darker red, almost to a black smoke. And then here I'm actually adding in just a little bit more white so I can pick out the edges of those flames so they can be a brighter yellow. You don't always necessarily have to do this, but I may have overdone it with the orange a little bit, like I tend to do. And so I'm just adding some white back in there, and then I can add the yellow back in as well, and it will bring out the edges of those flames a lot better. My apologies if some of this footage is very blurry. This is my first like actual painting video, so I am learning as I go. But right now I'm doing my best to touch up the eyes. I'm adding a little bit of white back into the eyeball, and then right here I'm actually trying to touch up the eyelids to close them up around the eye so they don't look so big and frightened. It's very, very, very tricky process. You don't want a whole lot of paint on the brush, but with these small brushes, they dry up very quickly, so you have to be fast with what you're doing. Faces can be very daunting sometimes. I know I was the type that always put helmets on my models instead of the option for a face because I was always afraid of painting them. And to be honest, that really hinders your progress because you don't get that chance to practice. So I would recommend just giving it a try. They're not going to look great at first, but I've gotten to the point where I'm getting a lot more confident with the faces. Right now I'm glazing in some Reikland Flesh Shade, try and bring out some of that depth and shadow and also smooth out some of the highlights that I just laid down. So there is certain things that you can do to go back in and fix up certain parts of the face so that it looks better. Sometimes it's a back and forth process, but you'll get there. Here's some more examples of painting flames. I accidentally missed a few steps here, but we've already got the yellow laid down at the very bottom. I'm trying to keep the yellow more inside of that cage that's holding the flame, and then as soon as it comes out of that cage, it starts turning to that orange. We'll add a couple layers of that orange because these are longer flames, so we can drag that transition out a little bit more. So I'm using a lot of colors to do this, which you absolutely don't need to use as many colors as I did. You could just apply more coats of each color progressively up towards the top so that they get darker and darker. The colors I am using are Bad Moon Yellow up to Iron Fist Yellow to Magma Droth Flame, which is kind of a gnarly jump, but you can thin down the Magma Droth Flame enough to where it goes on and still allows that yellow to shine through. And then I'll go to Ball Red and then to Blood Angels Red. And then I think I use Carenberg Crimson Shade on the very tips. And then maybe even a little bit of Nuln Oil at the very, very, very edge of the tips. But it's completely not necessary. You could probably just use one yellow, one orange, one red, and just work on those transitions a little bit more to achieve pretty much the same effect. I just have a lot of different colors that I've gathered over the years, so that's how I like to do it. So now we're just barely touching the tips of the flames with some Nuln Oil to just darken them down quite a bit. These flames were pretty long, so I was able to get away with using a few different darker colors at the very top. And then now I'm finally starting to pick out the metallics. Something I like to do when I'm painting is leaving all the metallics for the very end. It might be useless to do this, but my theory behind doing it is not contaminating your water. So if you can leave all the metallics till the very end, you can do all your normal colors, wash out your brush, and then when you're ready to go to the metallics, that's basically the last thing you have to do. So you don't have to worry about going back and forth and wash out your water cup a bunch of times. I just feel it helps speed up the process. Plus, usually all of this stuff that's metallic is usually on the outer portions of the model. One thing I always like to do is work on the stuff that is more in the recesses of the model and then work my way out from there. Sometimes this isn't always possible, but it makes things a lot easier as you go along. Another thing that I like to do is work out of the pot. I'm sure you've noticed this already, but I will actually thin my paints in the pot. This way I'm not wasting a bunch of paint on the palette. The only time I really put paint on the palette is when I'm doing layering work, in which I need to get the paint pretty thin and I need it to sit there for a really long time. If I'm just trying to block out certain colors, I'll put a couple drops of water in the lid of the pot where the paint is and mix it up in there so that I can just keep picking from there, and when I'm done I can close it back up. None of the paint is wasted and my paints last a lot longer because of that. Now when it comes to thinning the metallics, you really got to be careful because you don't want to go too thin, because then it will just leave like this sparkly sheen over the model where you're painting and it's not going to get like full coverage. You're gonna have to do a couple coats. But if you just thin it just a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 drops of water in the lid of the pot, that's usually good enough, just so that it's easier to work with. It doesn't bunch up and you don't see all those brush strokes and everything. It lays down nice and smooth, but it also covers very well at the same time. So now we're into this stage where I start washing a lot of the metallics. I like to use Nuln Oil, like everybody, for silver metallics, and Reikland Flesh Shade is what I like to use for gold. Right now I'm putting down the Nuln Oil first before I apply any of the gold stuff, because on this model there's a lot of places where the gold is overlapping the silver. So I wash all the silver and then start picking out all my gold stuff. Now we're starting to wash all the gold stuff, and this is when the model really starts to come together. Everything has its color on it. You're really working on like the last 2 stages. After this is when I'll start to do the edge highlights and stuff. I'll explain that in a minute. But this is where it starts to get exciting, because you start to feel a little bit more confident in the piece of work that you're doing, and everything's starting to come together. Everything is starting to look cohesive. I really like this stage of the paint job. So it looks like here I actually missed a couple spots with gold, the little letters in each of the stairs. And for this, you just want to have a very little bit of paint on the tip of the brush. You don't want it oversaturated. I usually wipe it off a little bit on the paper towel or on my thumb, and then you're just grazing over the top of them. You don't really want to get in there too much because then it'll start to bleed out over the edges. You're just very, very lightly grazing across the top of those letters to get that gold on there. If it falls into like any of the recesses, don't worry too much because we're going to come back over that with a wash and it's going to fill that stuff in and it'll look great. All right, so now I've glued the model that stands inside of it, and we've got a pretty much completed model. I'm gonna go ahead and start adding some edge highlights. And I do this at the very end because it's a very tedious task. And if I save it for the very end, I may have to be more careful of not hitting anything or nicking anything, but we already have to do that as it is. As painters, we're always very cautious of where we're putting our brush. So as long as you're cautious of where you're putting your brush, you can put your highlights at the very end of a paint job because you're only looking for the areas that actually need it. When you're doing this, you want to use a thin brush with a good point because sometimes you will need to use the point, but most of the times I'm using the side of the brush and dragging it along the edges. You also don't want to thin the paint, just take it straight out of the pot and then rub it on a paper towel so that your brush isn't oversaturated. It's almost like in between dry brushing and normal use of the paintbrush. I think the model still will look great at the end of it. I'm not like super upset with it, but there's a couple things that in the future, now I know what to do differently so it actually looks better. All right, so in the end, I think it turned out really good. Honestly, I'm actually kind of happy with the model. I can't be too upset with it. Yeah, there's some things that I could have done differently, but like I said before, you can't let that hold you back. You just got to keep moving forward. That's the best way to get around these frustrations with certain models. It's something that I deal with a lot. I don't know why. I'm very hard on myself as a painter. I tend to be a perfectionist, so I'm always trying to strive to be better, and that's a good thing, but it's something that you can't always be too hard on yourself about. Sometimes in the imperfections lies that unique element of painting. So if you made it this far in the video, I really do appreciate it. This is my first like actual painting video. I hope to do a lot more. I'm also going to be working on some other different types of content based around Warhammer, wargaming in general. Hobbying, 3D printing is something that I really like to do too. So stay tuned for all that content. Please subscribe if you're into any of that type of stuff. If you have any criticism or critiques, or if you did gain some value out of this video and learn something new, please comment down below and let me know what you think of the video. Other than that, leave me a like and you guys have a great day.